remember a time when things were affordable? I mean, like, more affordable than they are right now. At least, like, a little bit. Like, a tiny bit. How did we get here?
It's time for SIMBIB, it's time for SIMBIB.
Hello folks, welcome back to Stuff I Make Because I'm Bored. My name is Sin and I will be your host, and today I want to talk about the price of everything being too goddamn high. There's an old meme for ya. Everything is expensive, from food to housing to transportation and even raw textile goods like fabric. And I want to know why. Whose fault is this? I want to know who to be mad at. Economics as a whole is an incredibly complicated field of study. There are so many factors that contribute to the cost of living rising and falling that it's really difficult to pinpoint any one specific thing as the reason that bell peppers cost a truly absurd $5 a pop. But due to its complexity, I want to focus this video on just one part of this whole puzzle. And maybe down the road I'll talk about other pieces, though I make no promises. Today I want to talk about minimum wage, because it feels like such a contentious subject. Arguments on whether it should be higher, or it should be lower, or it's good actually, or it's actually really bad, make it really hard to get any solid answers on it. But there's a lot of people out there who have done research on it that are smarter than me. So I want to look at their research and draw up my own conclusions to see how minimum wage affects the cost of living. I'm going to focus on Canada and the US for the basis of this research, making sure to differentiate between countries as different information applies. I picked them because they have quite a different approach to their minimum wages, and also they are basically the same country. So their economics are fairly easy to compare. Let's dig into it. Part 1. So what is minimum wage? I mean, this part's obvious, right? Minimum wage is the minimum amount of money that somebody needs to make in order to afford to live where they do. Right? Well, no, that's actually not the case. That's minimum livable wage. Easy mistake, and also something completely different. Minimum wage is purely the minimum amount of money that a company legally must pay you per hour in order to comply with the law of that area. Between Canada and the states were the first to introduce a federal minimum wage in 1938 with the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was created to protect laborers and provide them with a set of minimum income as well as maximum work hours and other things. In America, the federal minimum wage across the country is currently $7.25 per hour, unless you're a person who works for tips like a server, in which case your minimum wage is, am I reading that right? $2.13 per hour. Granted, when you get your tips, you must be making at least $7.25 per hour or else your employer makes up the difference, but you know, like, wow, okay, that's very little. Anyway, the minimum wage also differs between states. About 30 states have their minimum wage higher than $7.25, the highest being DC at $17 per hour, with an average minimum wage of approximately $11.81 for the states that have higher wages. In Canada, the minimum federal wage is $16.65 as of April 1st, 2023. Like in America, individual provinces and territories can also set their own minimum wage, and for both countries, the federal rate trumps the local rates if the federal rates are higher. And, well, since the federal minimum wage increased from $15.55 to $16.65 last April, the only places with a higher minimum wage are BC and the Yukon Territories at $16.75 and $16.77 respectively, so an average of $16.76, I guess. Also, Ontario and Alberta have an exemption for student workers and workers under 18 who work during the school year at a rate that's lower than the federal minimum wage at about $13 per hour, and Quebec also has a law that folks who work for tips have a minimum wage of just $12.20. Sorry, Quebecers. This was set after the April 2023 federal minimum wage hike though, so I'm genuinely a bit unsure as to how Ontario, Alberta, and Quebec can do that. But that does raise a question. When the minimum wage is decided, or overruled, I guess, what is this decision based on? Part 2. Who sets it and based on what? In America, the minimum wage hasn't changed on a federal level since 2009. Before that, the FLSA was changed fairly frequently since its introduction in 1938, going both up and down as the market demanded, depending on who was in charge at the time. The last increase in 2009 raised the minimum wage from $6.55 to the current $7.25. In Canada, the last big jump was in 2021 when the minimum wage was raised from, I believe, to be maybe $5 per hour to $15 per hour, but it's really hard to tell what the federal minimum wage was between 1996 and 2021, as the chart that I'm following has it listed as being $0 in 1996, and everything I look up links back to this stupid chart, which which is annoying. So I'm saying $5 as an average of what the other provinces were at the time, and also it's a $1 increase from May 1986 when it was $4. So in both countries, the minimum wage is set by the federal government, but the individual provinces and states can also set their own rates at the local level. Think of this as the federal government setting the bar, and each local government can raise it or leave it as they want to. But how do they calculate these increases? Let's have a look at the federal government of Canada and some of the local governments in the states. For the past 3 years in Canada, the minimum wage has been updated and decided based on the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, of the country. The CPI is calculated using the consumer cost of goods such as housing, food, transportation, etc., and the CPI inflation tracks how the overall costs compare to previous ranges in time. For example, the CPI inflation after 2022 was about 6.8% in Canada, so the minimum wage rose from $15.55 to $16.65, an increase of 7.07%. In America, there are currently about 12 states that also annually review their minimum wages, and they base them on the same thing, their local CPI. Okay, good. Now we know what the minimum wage is and how it's calculated in most places. But I earn more than minimum wage, and I know a lot of other people do as well, so what the going rate is where I live doesn't really matter to me. It's not relevant. I mean, it's not like raising minimum wage raises the cost of living, and it's not like it causes inflation or whatever, right? It's inconsequential. Right? Part 3, the economic consequentials. Okay, let's discuss the elephant in the room. Minimum wage is bad. Okay, well, I don't know about that, but there are a lot of people who believe that raising minimum wage is bad because it will hurt the economy. Their main argument is that if companies, especially small companies, suddenly have to pay their employees a higher wage, then they won't be able to stay in business, so they have to raise their prices to compensate, or worse yet, they would need to lay off employees, causing an increase in unemployment. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people who support raising the minimum wage, stating that well-paid employees work harder, are more satisfied with their work, they would have more income to spend and thus bolster the economy, and it would also work to raise people out of poverty. So let's take a closer look at these arguments to see if any of them hold water. Argument the first: minimum wage increases causes job losses. For most of these arguments, I will be referring to a study called The Minimum Wage, Lost Jobs and Poverty in Canada, published in 2021 by Philip Cross for the Fraser Institute, linked in the description. Philip's study draws conclusions based on several other studies on the effects of minimum wage increases on the economy, all cited in his study. So, based on Philip's study, which is based on other studies, what do the studies have to say about studies? I mean, job losses when it comes to wage increases. Turns out, like much of economics, wage hikes are a complicated thing to research, since the effects of minimum wage increases don't show up in the labor market the very next day, or even the next month. The effects are gradual or aggregated over a long period of time, maybe even a year or longer. Additionally, there might be bias in self-reported data collection, since large companies who are already holding strong are likely not to feel the increase in minimum wage as much, while smaller companies who went under due to the wage hikes would be unable to report their status. Similarly, since wage hikes rarely occur in isolation, there are other economic factors in effect, such as high or low inflation, recessions, economic booms, and so on and so forth, which could impact employment, making it difficult to isolate any amount of job loss to wage hikes specifically. But in general, most studies that Philip cites show one thing: hiking the minimum wage does affect job loss. Most of the studies that he cites show that the effect is most strongly felt by youth, who are unable to find, quote, low-skill jobs, unquote, such as fast food workers. This is at least in part due to higher wages causing companies to lower the amount of staff that they hire, or to bias towards employees with more experience. This is a double-edged sword, of course, since hiring only employees with experience means folks who are trying to break into the job market, such as teens, can't break in. Can't get experience without a job, can't get a job without experience. You feel me? In general, most studies cited by Philip estimate that a minimum wage increase of 10% causes an approximate 1 to 3% decrease in employment among youth and folks who work in, quote, low-skill jobs. Some are a bit higher and say it's between 3 and 6%. However, a different study, The Effect of Minimum Wages on Low-Wage Jobs by Doruk Cengiz, Aranjaya Dubey, Attila Lindner, and Ben Zipperer, published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, or QJO, has a different perspective. I'm going to refer to this study as the QJO study for the sake of clarity. I guess I could also call it the Doruk Aranjaya Attila Ben study? The Dorinate Ben study? Sen Dublin Zip study? I'm just gonna stick with QJO. The QJO study claims that studies such as Philip's tend to review data on job loss based on broad demographics, most often youth and low-skill workers. Youth and folks who work in... The QJO study, however, went with a different approach, looking at employment changes locally per wage level. They argue that it's critical to look at employment rates by wage and not by demographic, since these jobs show the actual effect of minimum wage hikes. And by focusing on employment rates based on wages instead of demographic, they can also see how changes affect higher income jobs, if they affect them at all. They also focused on a longer time period, ranging from 3 years before the change to 5 years after. What they found, if I'm understanding their conclusion correctly, is that there's no significant change in the amount of jobs available. A lot of the lowest paying jobs disappeared when minimum wage increases. But this is explained since the jobs that paid below the new minimum wage are now jobs that pay the new minimum wage. Essentially, jobs with lower wages disappeared and joined the jobs that previously were already at that wage. Also, their findings show that there's actually an increase in jobs that pay $1 to $2 more than the new minimum wage, and a, quote, statistically significant rise in jobs that pay $3 above the minimum across the 5-year term after the minimum wage increase. Furthermore, they found that there was only negligible changes to the employment rates for jobs paying $5 to $17 or more dollars above minimum wage, suggesting that higher income folks are not affected by changes in the minimum wage employment-wise. So, does minimum wage affect employment? I would argue based on both studies that yes, it does, but not necessarily by destroying jobs or by creating jobs. I would say that it tends to shift the people that are in certain job brackets. As the QJO study mentioned, there might not be an overall loss of available jobs, but Phillips' study shows that the folks who end up employed in these jobs tend to skew more in favor of older workers or workers with more experience. It is also worth mentioning that Phillips' study focused almost exclusively on Canada, while the QJO study focused exclusively on America. Argument the second, minimum wage increases lift people out of poverty. This is another complicated topic. The whole of economics is complicated, I don't know why I mention it every time. Phillips' study also touches on the subject and claims that, of course, wage hikes do not lift people out of poverty, at least not to a significant degree. He cites that the Congressional Budget Office of America, or CBO, argues that doubling the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 would only lift 3.8% of families out of poverty. The reason this percentage is so low is that many people who work in minimum wage jobs live in households that are already higher income, such as teenagers who live with their families. Furthermore, people who contribute a large amount of income for low-income households are also frequently teenagers, the same people who are most at risk of losing their jobs due to minimum wage hikes. These two factors mean that poor families don't generally benefit from higher minimum wages. Another study, called Minimum Wages and Poverty, New Evidence from Dynamic Difference in Difference Estimates, by Richard V. Birkenhauser, Drew McNicholas, and Joseph J. Sabia for the National Bureau of Economic Research, or NBER, looks at the same data in a different light but comes to a similar conclusion. Their data, spanning across nearly 4 decades, finds that minimum wage increases only help to lift about 0.17% of families out of poverty. More specifically, they found that a lot of people who live in poverty, namely elderly folks, either don't work for minimum wage or work at all, and thus would not be helped by an increase in the minimum wage. Other studies that I found all come to the same or similar conclusions. Raising minimum wage does very little to actually help lift poor families out of poverty. In fact, I wasn't able to find a study that supports this claim at all. So I feel pretty confident saying that raising the minimum wage does help poor families, but only very, very slightly. Argument the third, minimum wage increases cause inflation. First, we need to define inflation. Inflation is essentially the buying power of your money decreasing. How much can you buy for $1? If it's less than the previous year, that's caused by inflation. Inflation is also a fetish where, as I mentioned before, raising the minimum wage increases the overhead costs for businesses. And since the business's whole thing is making money, they don't want that overhead eating into their profits. So if the minimum wage is increased, companies are likely to pass that cost increase on to their customers. A 2017 report by the Bank of Canada concluded that raising the minimum wage does have an effect on CPI inflation. They suggest that the, at the time, proposed 1% increase in minimum wages would equate to an estimated 0.1 percentage point increase in CPI inflation. They also cite a similar study in the US, which showed a 10% increase in minimum wages would equate to an estimated 0.4% increase in CPI inflation. A percentage point increase is different than a percent increase, by the way. If the number of people who lost their hats increased from 10 to 15%, it went up by 5 percentage points. But you can also say that it increased by 50%. Lots of people use this phrasing to scare you with statistics, by the way. Moving on. Adam Hayes for Investopedia has a very interesting article about inflation and minimum wages, aptly named, "Does Raising the Minimum Wage Increase Inflation?" In it, he reiterates that it's difficult to pinpoint a specific effect of minimum wage increases on the economy as a whole, based on how many different effects it has in a broad sense. An argument against minimum wage increases is that having a federally mandated minimum wage means companies can't competitively bid for workers, creating an artificial floor and requiring companies to raise their prices. Minimum wages could also put small businesses out of business, causing a drop in supply and thus increasing costs. But arguments for minimum wage increases posit that, like the Bank of Canada study said, increasing minimum wage has not historically created significantly higher inflation. Even if companies hire less workers, a higher unemployment rate would cause the population to spend less money, thereby reducing inflation as companies would lower their prices to account for lower demand. That's really all I can find on studies that directly compare inflation with the rise of minimum wages. So I guess I can conclude that yes, minimum wages do contribute to inflation, but based on the numbers presented by the Bank of Canada, raising the minimum wage only contributes to a very, very small amount of inflation. Argument the fourth, higher wages create better employees. I would say it's basically a no-brainer to say that getting paid better means that people will want to work harder, or at least will want to work. Most research on this topic is not aimed specifically at minimum wage though, but in essence it should apply to minimum wage jobs anyway, right? Being paid better means that employees have more reasons to stay at a company, reducing turnover, which in turn reduces company overhead. Employees are less likely to be absent for non-sick related reasons, they tend to have better morale, and thus work more efficiently. A study performed by Dr. Meng Sun tried to put this sort of ethereal effort idea into some sort of quantifiable data. In his paper, Effects of Minimum Wage on Workers on the Job Effort and Labor Market Outcomes, he concluded that higher minimum wage does motivate employees to be more productive, but this is likely due to there being a slightly lower amount of available jobs, so people work harder to avoid being fired, which I guess is less positive. Stronger workers also equate a stronger overall work pool though, which benefits companies as a whole. And this also has an upward spillover effect, which causes higher paid workers to be paid more as well. So I guess I call this one a yes. Higher minimum wages do create better employees. Does it create happier ones though? To that I would say no, as work harder to avoid being fired would not make me in particular feel very happy. It would make me stressed out about doing a good enough job to stay employed. Argument the fifth. Higher minimum wages causes lower compensation. What? How could higher minimum wages mean less compensation? Well, that's simple. Needing to pay higher wages means a company has less money to spend on employees in other ways, like benefits. Many companies only pay out benefits if workers work for a specific amount of hours per week. A 2021 American study by Chiping Yu, Sean Mankad, and Masha Shunko for the Harvard Business Review found that though the number of hours worked per company remained the same, for every $1 in minimum wage raises, the amount of employees who worked for more than 20 hours per week fell by 23%, while the workers who worked 30 hours or more per week fell 14.9%. This means that those specific companies hired more staff to work less often in order to pay less in retirement and healthcare benefits, and existing staff all worked less hours, thus getting paid less even if their wages increased. Which sucks. Part 4. The government's role in all of this. As I've said like 8 times in this video already, economics as a whole is extremely complicated, so I want to look at one more factor that ties into minimum wage. The real elephant in the room. The government! Yeah, the entity responsible for setting the minimum wage. Those guys. See, the government is the one who sets the legal mandate for what a company must pay its employees. But based on the conclusions that I can reach from my research, minimum wage doesn't affect the economy in the way that governments are proposing that it does. It doesn't raise families out of poverty, it doesn't really affect the overall gross spending or economic health of a nation, and due to companies decreasing employee benefits or reducing their labor force, it doesn't even really seem to positively affect workers, at least not in the United States. So why raise minimum wage then? Well, if your yearly pay does not increase at least to match inflation, you're losing money. And since companies only care about making money, what incentive would they have to increase their employees' pay on a yearly basis to keep up with inflation if it's not legally mandated by the government? A $10 per hour wage doesn't hold nearly as much power today as it did 10 years ago. Hell, it doesn't even hold as much power as it did 2 years ago. Raising the minimum wage to keep up with inflation feels like the minimum a government can do to ensure that folks at the bottom of the income chain at least make the same amount of money as they would have the year before. Part 5, in conclusion. So let's put all the elements together. 1. Minimum wage increases do not cause job loss. It causes a slightly higher unemployment rate in certain demographics and slightly increases employment in others. Number 2, minimum wage increases do help families out of poverty, but at an extremely low rate per percent increase in wages. 3. Minimum wage increases do affect inflation, but again at extremely low rates per percent increase in wages. Number 4. Minimum wage increases do create better workers. And number 5, in some areas, minimum wage increases causes higher wages, but overall lower pay due to reduction in hours worked or reductions in benefits granted by employers. So what does this mean? Despite how negative all these elements seem, I don't think raising the minimum wage in general is a bad thing. Like I said, I firmly believe if wages aren't rising to match inflation, you're basically losing money. However, governments should be increasing the minimum wages in conjunction with other policies. Policies that prevent companies from reducing work hours just to avoid paying benefits, for example. Maybe mandating companies provide a certain level of benefits no matter what the hours worked are. Or maybe tackling this from another angle and putting policies in place that reduce the overall cost of healthcare. I mean, getting a crown installed in Canada with no benefits costs like $5,000 per tooth. Whatever, watch my dental drama video for more on that. I don't have a conclusive answer. All I can say for sure is that minimum wage increases have a very small effect on the economy as a whole and cannot, broadly speaking, be blamed for the soaring cost of living. I mean, take Canada and the United States for the perfect example. Canada's CPI inflation for 2023 was 3.9%, while its minimum wage increased by 7%. The CPI inflation for America was 3.4%, and their minimum wage didn't increase at all. Well, that certainly was an informative journey for me. I actually learned a lot and sort of changed my stance on minimum wage. Mostly, I went from fully supporting it to supporting it strongly, but with additional caveats in regards to worker protections. But while I now understand the role of minimum wage a bit better, when it comes to the rising cost of living, I still don't fully see why the cost of living has gotten so absurd. So I guess next time I'll take a deep dive down another rabbit hole to see if that provides any clarity. What do you think is causing the rising cost of living? Is the cost of living crazy where you are? Is there something specific that you'd like me to take a deep dive on? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for spending some time with me. Leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future. I post videos every Tuesday at noon Eastern. If you want to hear from me more often, you can follow me on my social medias. You can find the @ here and in the description. But that's all for today, folks, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye! SIMBIB, stuff I make because I'm bored. I'm making progress in my create a project plan. So far, I've made a schedule that represents how much I do in a week, and I'm upset at just how much of my life is eaten away by just my day job.